Hello. I'd like to talk to you about the Famicom Disk System, which was a neat little add-on to the Famicom, or the Family Computer, which was the Japanese version of the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System. It, as it implied, was a disk drive that could be attached to the Famicom. It was Nintendo's try at alleviating a problem that cartridges had at the time, as not only could they not hold a whole lot of space, they were also rather expensive. So, in 1986, Nintendo released the Famicom Disk System. The Famicom Disk System would end up being kind of a weird thing. It was the launch of several of Nintendo's most famous franchises, things like Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Kid Icarus. Some of those games got released for the Famicom Disk System. But it also served as kind of a hotbed for companies' weird games. Games that didn't really feel like, I guess, warranted the cartridge price. There was some very bizarre games, and, well, to be honest, there's also quite a lot of trash on it. But even though the system kind of had its fair share of oddities, it has a sense of charm that I think should get recognized. Now, before I get into the games that were available for the Famicom Disk System, or at least a little bit more in depth with them, let me talk to you about how the thing actually worked, because it worked kind of interestingly since it needed to connect to the Famicom somehow. So let me show you how that worked. Here's a picture of a Famicom Disk System connected to a Famicom. The way that the disk actually gets the data to the Famicom itself is through that black box at the top that's connected to the cartridge port. That actually holds 32 kilobytes of RAM. And that's important because disks as a whole could only hold 112 kilobytes. So that's going to require games to have to load in data but during gameplay, but since it's a disk drive, that's kind of comes with the territory. And also, something kind of interesting is that this can hold 112 kilobytes of data. The whole thing can. The discs are double-sided, so each can hold a little bit under 64 kilobytes. That means that games often have to flip over during gameplay, but most games usually place them at rather convenient spots. Most games usually have their menu on disc or the side A, and then usually the game part is actually on side B, with the only gameplay being that's on side A being like usually the very end of the game. One interesting note about how the Famicom Disk System receives power, though, I feel like I should mention. Now, Nintendo had the foresight to realize that since most power outlets have two jacks in them, one's going to be occupied by the TV, because you need to see it, and one's going to be occupied by the Famicom, because, well, that needs power. Disk systems definitely need power, and they couldn't think of a way to actually take it from the Famicom itself, so they realized that, well, let's not rely on people having surge suppressors or something like, if those were even available in 1986. So let's just put a giant battery slot on the back of it. Yeah, that's 6 C-cell batteries in there, which probably kind of expensive at the time, if you think about it. But I should say, though, with my Famicom Disk System, I've had to only replace the batteries like twice, and I didn't even have to do it once. I was just trying to make sure. This thing has pretty good battery life and can last quite a long time. I mean, I've had mine 8 years, and I've only had to change it twice. So it has pretty good battery life. So, now that we've gotten kind of the way that it works out of the way, let's talk about the things that the system actually added. One of the things that will be very apparent if you play certain Famicom Disk System games is that the games sound weird. The Famicom Disk System adds a sound chip to the Famicom's library of sound generation that uses a form of wavetable synthesis, which is a kind of peculiar way of sound generation that I don't think any other console uses. It gives the certain Famicom Disk System games, at least the ones that use it, a kind of sound that is, well, unique to anything that I've ever heard. Best way to describe it is, well, just listen to it. For example, here's the title screen of the Western version of The Legend of Zelda. It's a cartridge game, so it doesn't have the ability to use the sound chip that the Famicom disk system had, as, well, we never had a disk system, so we wouldn't have had the sound chip. Now, let's compare that to the disc version of Zelda no Densetsu, the Hyrule Fantasy. That's quite the difference. Now, I personally really love the sound of the Famicom Disk System sound chip. To me, it just sounds organic, unlike most other sound chips where you can really tell where the little, I guess, notes of a song are really kind of piece by piece. There's not a whole lot of organic flow, whereas the Famicom Disk System sound chip can really actually produce a nice little organic sounding flow to the music that sounds like it's almost being played like an actual instrument. The Famicom Disk System can actually produce some really good sounding like horn or wind instrument replications. For example, here's the title music for Shin Onigashima. Here you go. Now, since the Famicom Disk System's sound chip only adds one additional channel of sound, games have to choose between using it for music or sound effects. Here's an example of the sound chip being used for sound effects. Now, let's take a look at Zelda 2 for the NES and its magic casting sound effect. Now, let's hear the magic casting sound effect of The Legend of Zelda 2, Rinku no Boken. Another feature that the Famicom Disk System added that was rather nice was the fact that, well, games were on floppy disks. And one of the benefits of floppy disks is that, well, you can write data just as well as reading data. Therefore, games that normally wouldn't have save slots actually now can have rather easily implemented save slots. This meant that games that normally would require one sitting in a cartridge-based format, you can pick up and play where you left off. Games like, well, Section Z, Castlevania, and Metroid and Kid Icarus all had save slots in the Famicom Disk System, which made playing them a little bit easier since you didn't have to deal with passwords or just not having save slots at all. Now, while I'm showing you these screenshots, I should mention one thing that would be very nice to know if you are a non-Japanese language speaker. the games on the Famicom disk system are relatively non-Japanese speaker friendly. This message, for instance, B-men wo satoshite kudasai. Now, you don't need to know exactly what that means in whatever language you speak. You can see that it's using the alphanumeric character B. And the only instance in which it uses that is if you need to flip the disk over, as the sides are labeled side A and side B. So if you see a message like that in any game, even if the messages are in Japanese, you can tell that you need to flip the disk over. So you can generally get through games. I mean, if the game requires languages to know hints and all that, you might be stuck. But other than that, these games are actually relatively easy to play. That being said, language isn't normally an issue with these kind of games, as you can see here, most games put their messages in English. Some even try a little bit too hard to put it in English. Yeah. Now, back on the subject of floppy disks. Now, the RAM adapter can only hold about half of one side's game's data at a time, so therefore you're going to have to deal with some loading times. But most games don't actually have that terribly long of loading times. In fact, there seems to be a set time that loading takes. It depends upon how many times that the RAM adapter has to go to memory or to the disk itself to get memory. For example, here's a video I shot of Yume Kyujo Doki Doki Panic and its loading screens. That wasn't too terribly long for a loading screen, and I gotta admit, I really like that nice ka-chunk noise that the Famicom disk system makes when it has to get data from the disk. That being said, not every game is Doki Doki Panic. There are some games that have particularly longer loading times for some reason. Metroid, for example, is one of those. The loading screens usually occur, in fact only occur, whenever you're going from one area to another, for instance going from Brinstar to Norfair or Brinstar to Kraid's Lair. That's not a too terribly common occurrence, but it still happens rather frequently. Here's an example of that. Now, I'm showing you going back up because one of the common things that's happened to me while playing Metroid on the Famicom disk system is actually only hitting up as soon as I get down, which means that not only do you have to go through the loading screen of going back up, but you have to go sit through it again going back down. It is very annoying, especially since I timed this. It seems like it takes about 30 seconds to get from one area to the other, and having to wait a minute to get just because you hit a button accidentally is rather frustrating. Now that I've showed you a kind of an intro to the Famicom disk system, I figured I might as well show you some games. I picked out a nice little sample of games that kind of encompass like all the categories of games that you can find on the Famicom disk system. Here's just a select few of the available. This is Section Z. There's a game that was actually available on the NES, but it was missing one crucial thing as in cartridge form. You had to play the entire game from start to finish. And to me, this represents one of the categories of games that Famicom disk system has, is games that we got in America, or the West I should say, but are actually made better being on the disk system, because now I can actually play this game to its full on an actual piece of hardware rather than on an emulator, because now that I actually have save slots, I can actually, not have to beat the entire game in one sitting, which, considering that Section Z is actually rather long for a shooter, is kind of a hard thing to do. This is Final Command, Akai Yusai, which translates roughly into Final Command, the Red Fortress. Now, some of you might recognize this game, as it was released in the West as Jackal. One thing that those of you who are familiar with Jackal might have noticed is that the screen seems somewhat claustrophobic compared to the NES version of Jackal. The game does, at least this version, does not have the wide open areas that Jackal had, and in fact limits the screen scrolling vertically at least to, or horizontally rather, to the length of the screen that you see here. That's something that makes this not as fun to play on the Famicom Disk System as it is on the NES, and kind of represents some of the few games that are available on the Famicom Disk System that were available on the NES. They're just not as good to play on the Famicom Disk System. Zelda 2 is one of those games, but I'll cover that in a later video at some point. This is Arumana no Kiseki, which translates into The Miracle of Arumana. Now, this game did not come out to the NES, and kind of serves as one of the many hidden gems that you can find on the Famicom Disk System. It's a game made by Konami, back when they were actually making games. That's actually pretty interesting. It's kind of a non-standard, almost Bionic Commando-ish platformer, but you can actually jump in this one. And it's actually a fun little game, even though it can get rather hard. It's still fun, and the soundtrack's absolutely fantastic. This is Kick Challenger Airfoot Yasai no Kuni no Ashi Senshi. Whew! That long name translates roughly into Kick Challenger Airfoot Vegetable Country Foot Soldier. Now, this game kind of represents a series of very odd games that the Famicom Disk System has. There are quite a few games on the Famicom Disk System games that either have weird settings, weird play styles, or are just plain weird overall. This game falls into that later category. One thing that is not obvious from this video is its really weird control scheme in that you have to constantly either hold or mash A in order to move forward, while your movement with the control pad kind of moves you on one foot with a pivot, as you can kind of see there. It is actually rather bizarre to be controlling a tomato, but hey, it's a pretty fun game, and it's pretty weird. I'll just leave it at that. This is Appletown Monogatari, or Appletown Story. Now, this is actually a port of a Commodore 64 game called Little Computer People. And this kind of serves to represent the fact that, for some reason, the Famicom Disk System seems to be Japanese developers' dumps for making ports of European computer games. There's quite a few of them that show up, and it's actually a rather alarming amount. Games, and they're mostly the obscure ones. I mean, there's some pretty notable ones in there. For instance, Rare's Night Lore, or at least back when they were Ultimate, Night Lore got a port. Monty on the Run got not so much a port as it is kind of a weird remake. Not even a remake, as it just basically has the name of the game on it, and it has the song and the title of it. But anyway, there are a lot of ports of games that appeared on the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 on European and American shores. Although, that being said, there are a lot of games that first appeared on the MSX. It is also interesting that even though these games originated on computers, they're actually fairly elegant in their transformation from computer games to console games. Not a whole lot was lost, that is, providing that it stays faithful to the game and isn't a complete reboot. This is Koneko Monogatari, The Adventures of Chatran, which translates into A Kitten Tale, Adventures of Chatran. Now, this game represents the fact that, for some reason, licensed games on the Famicom Disk System never really seemed to be of, like, the big, famous licenses. Sure, there was a few Gundam games and a few Ultraman games, but the majority of licensed games on the Famicom Disk System were of really more obscure franchises than compared to ones you would find on the Famicom. This one, for instance, is actually based on a movie that some of you might not have realized was a Japanese film. The Japanese film Koneko Monogatari eventually came to the West as The Adventures of Milo and Otis. There are some other franchises that were represented on the Famicom Disk System that might be more familiar with more hardcore anime fans, I guess you could say. Franchises like Dirty Pair and Patlabor received games on the Famicom Disk System. Now, as you can kind of expect from licensed games of the era, they aren't very good. This one definitely not being an exception. But there were a few good licensed games. Maybe a handful, maybe one or two. But a good majority of them were complete trash. Which brings me to the next game. This is Relics and Koku Yosai, or Relics Darkness Fort. And this game is a complete pile of trash. It doesn't really succeed on, well, anything. It controls terribly. The story, other than involving some sort of morphing robot thing that you play as, even if I could understand what the plot is, it just seems kind of generic 80s, to be honest. And it's just not very fun to play. As you can see here, it has some nice features like, say, the fact that you can destroy the environment. But that comes at a pretty hefty cost, as you're about to see here. Oh, by the way, I should mention I'm walking backwards because, heaven forbid, hitting the left on the control pad moves you left. No, you have to hit up and then move left. Oh, and then, we're moving out of the first screen. That's a good time for a loading screen. A rather lengthy long loading screen. And it's not like another one's going to appear like in any second now. Oh wait, one does. Yeah, this game loads multiple times, even in the same room. And as you can see, it's just loading up the enemies. But not only is this game not fun to play, it stops you many times. And it's just rather annoying. That's the third loading screen within a minute of having this game on. This game has very little redeeming quality to it, and even on an emulator isn't that fun to play through. I've done it, and it's just completely unsatisfying. And yeah. Not to mention the fact that this game, even though it has some nice destruction effects, is just incredibly ugly, and the soundtrack for it is just the most generic sounding thing I've ever heard. It's just blech. The sad thing is that there's probably games that for the Famicom Disk System that could almost consider it to be worse. This game, or this system, when it wants to produce bad content, it goes completely all out. This is Deep Dungeon Mado Senki, or Deep Dungeon The Heretic War. And this represents pretty much the games that I haven't really mentioned yet, which there is quite a few on the Famicom Disk System, which are just games that are, well, just plain generic. There's a lot of middling games, or games that are okay and fun to play, but just doesn't have any, like, pizzazz to it. It just exists. This game in particular, I swear, this is like, whenever movies or games or anything references those generic RPGs, like puts the characters in some sort of generic fantasy land, this is the game they're talking about. It just feels blah. It's not absolutely terrible, and sure, time and the fact that this is one of the first set of JRPGs to come out, especially dungeon crawling ones on the Famicom, I can give it some slack, but it just doesn't feel great, and it has some really bad things in that many early RPGs had that kind of feels like fake difficulty. It's fun to play, or it's interesting just from a historical standpoint, but it just isn't that great. Which kind of encompasses a few of the games that the Famicom Disk System has, and actually when I mean few, I mean, well, probably half of the games, or the system's output. At least it's not terrible like the last game we showed. Also, I should state for the record the fact that no, this game is not in English default. I'm using a fan translation, which thankfully there are quite a few for many of the Famicom Disk System games, so that is something nice to know. I should mention that there is two other categories of games that I haven't mentioned. I'm not going to be taking a look at adventure games, of which there are many on the Famicom Disk System. My Japanese knowledge isn't that great enough to actually get through one, so unless there's an English translation, I don't think I'll be looking into many of them. And one other category of games I should mention, if you're looking at the Famicom Disk System's library, let me just say, if you come across a game that's unlicensed, run. Unless you want to be submitted to some very, let's just say, adult material. Well, I think that's a nice introduction to the Famicom Disk System. From now on this series, I'll be looking more in depth into particular games. I don't think I'll be doing a full 100% Let's Play on every single one of them, but I'll at least put a decent effort into at least showcasing a good majority of the games, if not all the ones I could find. So I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and hopefully you'll be joining me in taking a look at this, well, interesting little piece of Nintendo history. Hope to see you again.